And yes, we are investing in hundreds and even indeed thousands of new housing units right across the country in Indigenous communities.
Tonight, the state of emergency continues in Cat Lake, where mold is taking over already inadequate housing, leaving children and elders in the cold.
Is that the type of treatment that you get in the city of Thunder Bay?
An Ontario politician speaks up about the actions of a security guard against an Indigenous youth.
We have more grade 12 graduates, more self-confident people.
And the impact of improvements at the Alesix Nakota Sioux Nation School. Good evening, welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward. A Winnipeg college is trying to implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. Some institutions have been criticized for not doing that. But as Brittany Hobson reports, Red River College is trying to make positive change.
Red River College wants to indigenize post-secondary education. Since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission issued its 94 calls to action 3 years ago, the Manitoba institution has been working toward implementing them. The school has hired Carla Kematch to lead the charge.
The momentum for change has already started. The commitment is there from the college, from our president. We're looking at developing policy that will actually further assist us in making sure that the changes will be long-lasting and permanent.
The position is a first of its kind for the college. Kematch is tasked with creating programs and training for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students and administration. Rebecca Chartrand, Executive Director of Indigenous Strategy, says the role will build on work the college has already done.
It's not just about creating a position, a Truth and Reconciliation Manager position, but it's looking at how do we work with the existing infrastructure to make sure that we have success.
Some of that work includes building a sweat lodge on one of the campuses and creating Cree and Ojibwe language courses. Chartrand says the next step is educating staff.
Understanding all of those historical pieces that lead to unresolved historical tensions that obviously continue to play out in our workspaces.
As for Indigenous students, Kematch wants to make sure support extends past academics.
Usually when students were being supported, they were being supported strictly within the education setting, and they weren't taking in factors that really could impede an individual's success when they're studying. So if you don't have a safe house, if you don't have childcare, then it makes going to school very difficult.
This means looking at students' holistic wellness. Chartrand says in the end that's what answering the calls to action are about.
Improving the quality of life for Indigenous students, for their families, for communities. You know, that's what we want to see. Like, ultimately, that's what this is about, the reconciliation piece.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
The Alesix Nakota Sioux Nation in Alberta are celebrating. That's because a cultural program they started 20 years ago is still running, and they have a newly renovated school. Chris Stewart has more.
Council members, former chiefs, teachers, Government of Canada officials, and Chief Tony Alesix were at the Mini Cootie Centre to reopen the school after a $1 million renovation. The school was the first site in Canada to offer the Head Start program to preschoolers 20 years ago. The Head Start program teaches 3 to 5-year-olds local culture, language, social skills, nutrition, and more.
We prepare them into kindergarten, into school, into university or college. And then when they succeed in that way, they come back to the community to enrich our lives. So it's a cycle that we've learned to adapt and that we are building on.
Now, the program is offered in 134 communities and teaches nearly 5,000 preschoolers each year. Chief Alesix says that the Head Start program helps the youth learn the importance of their Stoney language and culture.
We still have our culture and identity here, and we have some very strong spiritual leaders in our community that continue to teach, continue to transfer knowledge, continue to transfer songs and stories.
Louise Potts is a teacher. She helped bring the Head Start program to Alesix 20 years ago. She says the program works and would like to see every Indigenous community in Canada be offered this program.
We have more grade 12 graduates, more self-confident people, more helpful people, and more open-minded youth. Of course, we're not going to get everybody, but as long as this keeps moving, it's going to overtake the rest.
Jada Potts took the Head Start program in 2003. She says when she came back to the community after leaving for years, she was able to quickly relearn the Stoney language. She credits Head Start.
I found that it all came back because of this program, because of Louise and Geraldine and all the flow workers that worked here that helped me retain the language as a child. I think that was one of the benefits of the program itself, because it was so culturally immersive.
The newly renovated school now has more space, is energy efficient, and has a quiet room. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Alesix, Nakota, Sioux Nation.
What a success story. Well, a new study by the Institute for Research on Public Policy was released this week. It focused on Indigenous self-determination in the North Circumpolar region, specifically on two different approaches taken by Inuit in Canada and the Sami people in Norway. We spoke with one of the study's co-authors earlier in Vancouver. Mr. Wilson, thanks for joining us. In terms of political jurisdictions, what are the four distinct Inuit regions in Canada that were part of your study?
So starting off in the west, we have the Inuvialuit settlement region, which is in the Northwest Territories. We have Nunavut in the Eastern Arctic. We have Nunavik, which is in northern Quebec, and Nunatsiavut, which is in northern Labrador.
In your study, you noted that the two groups, Inuit in Canada and Sami in Norway, took different paths to self-determination with two different concepts, which you called self-rule and shared rule. Can you briefly explain those notions?
So the idea of self-rule is that Indigenous communities and regions will have autonomy at the regional and local level, so they'll be able to make decisions over matters that affect them at the regional level. The idea of shared rule is that those regions and their representatives will have a connection to other levels of government which make decisions that influence them on a daily basis. So they'll have some input into decisions that are made at the federal level or the provincial and territorial levels.
And according to those case studies, and despite the progress in both countries to exercise self-determination, the study concluded that there's still a lot of work to do. So what is at stake and what should be done?
Well, I think a lot of progress has been made in Canada with the Inuit mostly focusing on self-rule, and the Sami in Norway and other parts of the Nordic countries focusing on shared rule. But I think in both cases, what we need is more of a balance between the two. So in the case of the Inuit, having greater connections between Inuit and other levels of government, be they federal, provincial, or territorial, and sort of institutionalizing those connections. We've had some progress on that in recent years with the creation of the Inuit Crown Partnership Committee, which brings together representatives from the Inuit regions under the umbrella of the ITK, or Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, meeting with senior officials and cabinet ministers at the federal level. So that's good progress, right? That needs to happen. But I think probably more work could be done on regularizing those meetings and maybe involving territorial and provincial officials who are also responsible for making decisions that affect each of those regions.
Mr. Wilson, we'll have to leave it there, but I appreciate you taking some time for us here today.
You're very welcome. It's nice to be on your program.
There's much more to come after the break, but first, here's a look at a story we're working on.
I'm Kent Driscoll in Iqaluit. The new Indigenous Language Act has Métis and First Nation leaders mostly happy. Not Inuit. Haluki Kuturik is the president of Nunavut Tungavik.
What a waste. So much effort and so much clear communication about what we wanted to see, and this is what we get?
Nunavut responds to Bill C-91, coming soon on APTN National News.
Here's a look at Thursday's weather forecast starting on the East Coast. -1 with snow for Halifax and Fredericton. -17 for Happy Valley Goose Bay. 22 below under the sun in Nain. -1 for Montreal. -3 with rain in Quebec City. +4 for London. +5 in Sarnia. 11 above in Windsor. -16 for Thunder Bay and Wawa. -19 in Sioux Lookout. 27 below for Puckatawagan, God's Lake, and Norway House. 22 below for Winnipeg, Brandon, and Dauphin. In Saskatchewan, -25 under sunny skies for Swift Current, Regina, and Yorkton. -27 for Meadow Lake, 30 below in Stony Rapids. Welcome back. Cat Lake First Nation is in a state of emergency because of a housing crisis. But as Willow Fiddler reports, there is also a health crisis that needs the government's immediate attention.
The chief of Cat Lake First Nation says the Minister of Indigenous Services needs to see the community's housing crisis for himself.
To us, it's really, really critical. And it's life-threatening. We've lost elders from respiratory problems. We've lost children. They can't go to school because they have skin diseases. We've had one medevac to London, Ontario, from playing in the mould in his house. It flared up when it got into his skin, and we nearly lost that kid.
In January, Cat Lake declared the state of emergency because of the poor housing conditions that are making kids like Lucas Mezite so sick they have to be medevaced out for treatment. Chief Kiwikabo said the ministry responded by sending officials to meet with them last week. They were shown pictures of the skin conditions affecting kids like Lucas and this 2-year-old baby who also lives in a home infested with mold.
They didn't commit to anything, even though we presented them with pictures, what our plans were. To me, it was an insult. I didn't even bother seeing him off after he came. That's how disappointed I was with the meeting.
This week there was another meeting, but with NDP Member of Parliament Charlie Angus and MPP Saul Mamakwa. They toured several homes in the community of about 700 people.
What I can't get over is the complete breakdown of health that I've seen. We need a full medical assessment in this community. There's people suffering from all manner of ailments that have to be related to the breakdown of health and from the constant exposure to black mold.
The leadership here says that constant exposure to black mold has been an ongoing concern for years. Back in 2006, Chief Kiwikabo was the community's health director.
And at that time already, we were getting letters from the health department that there was these kids that were being affected by the mold at that time.
Health professionals are still issuing similar letters warning of the dangers like this one for the 2-year-old girl. Please consider a relocation or renovation for this house, as the allergens and poor heating may be a possible cause of the child's symptoms. But the problem with that is there is nowhere for the 2-year-old and her family to move to. There are at least 60 families in Cat Lake who need housing.
And that's pure mold. It is pretty obvious to say that the whole entire ceiling itself is.
A recent inspection of over 100 houses funded by Indigenous Services revealed what community leaders already knew.
A majority of the homes had mold. We had suspected all along that it was these illnesses.
And that's just a visual inspection. Councillor Derek Spence says there's more you can't see.
Because once opening up these walls, it would expose a lot of the mold, and we can't really do that.
You know, the government has seen this before. They've known about this. They've done nothing. A crisis of this magnitude doesn't just happen. This is the result of the indifference of what we've seen at the Department of Indian Affairs and previous ministers.
On Tuesday, as Angus and Mamakwa met with Chief and Council, newly appointed Minister Seamus O'Regan released a statement saying that plans to help Cat Lake are underway, including establishing a community plan to replace homes that have been identified for full replacement.
We've talked to the minister twice, real short phone calls, and basically telling us that they're going to do all they can to help Cat Lake. But other than that, there hasn't been any timelines, dollars, so we have nothing to work with moving forward.
Kiwikabo says part of their action plan includes bringing in 40 mobile homes on the Winter Road for the families most affected by the mold. But that will require immediate funding from the government. Willow Fiddler, APTN National News, Cat Lake First Nation.
The federal NDP kept up the pressure on the government over the Indigenous housing crisis. They once again used question period to ask the Liberals what they are going to do to solve this problem. This time from Manitoba Member of Parliament Nikki Ashton.
The Honourable Order. The Honourable Member for Churchill-Kiwetinoong
Mr. Speaker, First Nations in this country are facing a housing crisis. 85% of First Nations in Manitoba report mold in their homes. We're talking about 15, 17, 20 people in a house. Babies, elders, families are suffering. In community after community, people are saying that things are not getting better. Things are getting worse. So my question to the Prime Minister is, does he not know that this housing crisis is literally making people sick? And when will his Liberal government move from talking and move to action to address this housing crisis on First Nations now?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, when we got elected in 2015, we heard loudly and clearly from Canadians that they wanted a renewal of the relationship and investments in Indigenous peoples that would begin to close the gaps and the inequalities that exist in Canada. And that is something we set about doing from the very beginning. We have since lifted 78 long-term boil water advisories in Indigenous communities. We have opened hundreds of new schools. We've invested in new health centres. And yes, we are investing in hundreds and even indeed thousands of new housing units right across the country in Indigenous communities. But we know there's more.
An Ontario MPP is speaking out about a video circulating on social media showing a security guard in Thunder Bay slamming a First Nations youth to the ground and handcuffing him. Sol Mamakwa is from Kingfisher First Nation, the same community as the youth in the video. Mamakwa arranged for the teen and mother to be taken to the hospital following the incident. He says the family are distraught and traumatized. Mamakwa intends to look into the matter further.
That type of treatment of our community people is unacceptable, and I know this family, is receiving treatment for healthcare services. Is that the type of treatment that we get in the city of Thunder Bay? Not only that, the Shoppers Drug Mart.
Thunder Bay police are continuing their investigation into the incident. Police were initially called to the store, they say, for a report of a theft. Loblaw, the parent company of Shoppers, said the incident was absolutely unacceptable and has recommended disciplinary action for the guard. In an email statement, Loblaw apologized to the family for what happened. The child welfare system was once again put in focus today. Our live show wrapped up a 3-week-long look at the system. We've got highlights from today's show coming up. Here's the rest of Thursday's weather forecast, picking back up in northern Alberta. Sunny skies at -25 for Fort McMurray. -18 in Medicine Hat, -22 for Red Deer. On the west coast, +1 with a rain-snow mix for Vancouver, 4 above in Tofino. -8 and snow in Smithers, sunny and 14 below for Dease Lake. -20 in Old Crow, -21 for Watson Lake, -25 for Fort Liard and Trout Lake, minus 22 for Sax Harbor and Tuktoyaktuk, 31 below in Colville Lake, 32 below for Cambridge Bay, minus 26 in Whale Cove, minus 26 for Resolute, minus 30 in Joe Haven. Welcome back. On today's In Focus, it was part 3 of a 3-part series looking into the Child and Family Services system. Melissa Ridgen talked to 2 girls who grew up in care and how they navigate the world after aging out of the system. A former CFS worker spoke about an emphasis on apprehension rather than on keeping families together, and explored a new program in Saskatchewan that is keeping high-risk moms and their babies together. Here's a few highlights.
It's very lonely. You have no sense of stability. You have no foundation. You learn to not get attached to places, people, things, school, environment, anything. You learn not to build connections because you know that it's probably going to be ripped right from you, because in a few weeks, a few months, a few days, however amount of time passes, a social worker is going to come and get you, and you're going to be put into another home. And so you don't even bother anymore. And that was something that I really struggled with, because how am I supposed to dream about the future? How am I supposed to know who I am? How am I supposed to build a community when I don't have a sense of community, because I'm constantly bouncing from community to community? And that was really hard for me growing up in the system.
I've seen it happen quite a few times where the worker would go into court and just, say, oh, well, the family doesn't have a lawyer. We'd like this to be remanded again for another month. And then, meanwhile here, the family was already talking to somebody in the hallway. They could have had somebody come in and start talking, but the agency was actually ready to handle the case. So they would do another month. And then we'd see them again in another month. We didn't have time to talk to the lawyers. We didn't have time to talk with the families and see what's going on. A lot of times, the apprehension doesn't need to happen, is that they could be placing the child with the family, the immediate family, until we can figure things out and get things sorted out in the way they are. This way the child doesn't need to come into the care.
The model is both innovative and has demonstrated in a very short period of time that working preventatively with people who have, the co-occurrence of trauma and addiction and mental illness, with the right supports in place, that we can keep children out of care.
And you can catch that entire episode and the entire series by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, or catch the replay tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. That's all the time we have for today. For the latest Indigenous headlines, download the APTN News app. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night.